What did you make of Secretary Pompeo's statement earlier today?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think Secretary Pompeo would make this kind of statement without really concrete and explicit information. And essentially, the Iranian regime wants us to think there's two choices. There's either no sanctions or war, as if there's nothing in the middle. And there's actually so many options in the middle, which include extended sanctions, which include surgical strikes, which include, limited confrontation. But definitely, the Iranian regime is trying to up the ante and make it appear to the U.S. administration, to the world, that there really are only two options, either no sanctions or war.
What about the optionality of just how hard it is going to be getting oil supply? What they seem to be threatening is the Strait of Hormuz. They didn't actually attack ships within it, but just at the entrance. Could this be a significant supply shock to the oil market?
I mean, of course, take this together with the attack on the Saudi airport, the attack recently on two other tankers that were in port in the UAE, bring this whole picture together. And yes, there is, at least Iran is trying to create the impression that there is a concrete threat to security of supply through the Gulf of Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, the U.S. has the capacity and when it will be necessary to keep that waterway open. But the big question we should be asking ourselves, with this kind of threat to the main center of global oil supply is not why has oil gone up today, but why hasn't it gone up higher? Because essentially this is hitting the center of oil at a time that a Russian pipeline, main supply line, is knocked out, Venezuela's in meltdown, Iran is already under sanctions, and now we're physical hits on the main waterway of oil.
Brenda, I wonder if this speaks more broadly to our approach to Iran, if this shows that it is working, or if the attacks last month and the second attacks today show that our coercion attempts aren't maybe the right approach.
So Taylor, I agree with you that this is an upgrading in Iranian behavior. I would say actually, this is kind of actually an act of desperation, because this is the kind of thing you do at the last minute. Clearly, if there's a concrete threat to the strait, this is going to bring the U.S. to take action that's going to keep that strait open. This is not something that the U.S. would tolerate in any sense. And so I think they're using kind of their only kind of difficult ammunition, at a very early stage in the game.
So talk more about the policy response that we might see forthcoming from the U.S. Nothing obviously imminently, but if there were to be more tensions, more attacks, what might we see the U.S. do in response?
Yeah, so I'd say one thing. I don't think the current regime in Iran understands the Trump administration, especially on the Iran question. I think they're looking at what happened last fall, before the beginning of the sanctions on Iran, when, in contrary to all the declarations of the Trump administration about getting tough on Iran and doing something, they actually gave extensive waivers to 8 countries. This highly disappointed Saudi Arabia. There seemed to be some kind of even a rift, because Saudi Arabia was, continuing with the cutback on the oil market, disappointing Trump on this. And I think the Iranian regime has it in their head that the U.S. the administration is really scared about high oil prices. I think that's wrong. I think, November was 2 weeks before the midterms. It's a very different oil spike versus, summer, 14 months, but 15 months before the next election. I think the Trump administration is very serious, on getting results here and isn't really afraid about an oil price spike.
Where does this put, Brenda, Europe? Because to a certain extent, those that remained within the nuclear agreement with Iran, have been trying to ease some of their economic pain. They haven't been very efficient about getting around to doing so. But does this put Europe in a bind as to how to treat Iran if we do start seeing US labeling Iran as some sort of adversary and a threat to, Norwegian tankers and Japanese ones?
Right. So I think we have to really separate, when we talk about Europe, between European companies and European governments. And I could say the same thing for Turkey as well. For a number of governments that have been against the reimposition of sanctions, have wanted to preserve the nuclear agreement. But you're seeing, really serious compliance on the side of European companies, even Turkish companies, which was an important oil market for Iran. And so the sanctions are working, despite what the governments are thinking. The companies are saying, we don't want to be cut off from the U.S. market. They're not willing to risk the sanctions. And I think that the sanctions have worked this much better than almost anyone anticipated. A lot of it had to do with this being the second round of sanctions, going back to, again, like the sanctions that were imposed under the Obama administration. Banks knew what to do, refineries knew what to do, the mechanisms were in place. Compliance is much more serious than I think Iran could have imagined, or even Iran watchers could have imagined.
So what does Iran do then? I mean, obviously, the efficacy of the sanctions having devastating effects on the Iranian economy. Where do they go next? What do they try to do to create some breathing room or space?
Right. So I think we'll see, more of these kind of attacks. I think they'll become, a new normal. It'll be part of our Middle East summer. I think that will, and then often Iran uses its proxies, so it could be, soft, terror targets, instead of oil infrastructure, but people, embassies throughout the world, Europe, anywhere, in order to, to create, a fear. But again, I think that these are the kind of tools that you can only use once. We saw this in 2006 during the Israel-Lebanon war, when essentially Iran asked, Hezbollah overused their, you sent your medium-range missiles. Once it's done, the threat's over. And so I think there aren't that many more tools Iran can pull out of the toolbox.